everybody. Welcome to the latest episode of the Dollar Big Bandits. I'm Warren Phillips.
I'm Mike Farah.
And first and foremost, thank you so much to Tomorrow's Publishing for always having our backs. Go to their website, twomorows.com. Check out all their wonderful publications, magazines, books, pamphlets, anything you want, it's there. Buy it. You'll love it. So, today's episode, we talk to a man who loves comics, and he loves every aspect of it. He knows so much about it, and talking to him was an absolute pleasure. I'm talking about Mr. Joe Illidge, mainly known for his editorial stuff with various books, and just somebody who you can tell is passionate about the business.
Yeah, I thought this was a very interesting interview, as they all are, but primarily Joe gives such a detailed account of what it's like to be an editor and what it's like to be sort of the ringleader on projects where you're not necessarily the writer, you're not the artist, but you're really bringing everybody together and pushing the story forward. So he had an interesting take on the comic book industry and, you know, the art of comic books and making them. So let's stop blathering and get to the interview. This is Joseph Illidge.
Pleased today to have author and editor Joseph Illidge. Joseph, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us this evening.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
First question we ask everybody is, how did you first discover comics?
I first discovered comics as a kid on the newsstands. My mom would take me every Friday after work to the newsstand, and she would buy me comic books. And my father actually was a fan of comic books as well. I tended to read superhero comics when I was a kid. My father tended to read Sergeant Rock, Deathlock, Jonah Hex. So he was inspired by those heroic archetypes that he saw on film and television. So comics have been with me ever since the second grade, as far as I remember.
So at what point in your life do you say, maybe it's a career I'd like to pursue as well?
I would say my first inkling of that was when I was a student of the High School of Art and Design here in New York, and a number of us knew a guy named Mark Matos, and one day he arranged to take a number of us to the Marvel offices. Now I'm talking the early 80s, and that was the first time that I ever saw the offices of a comic book company. And I still remember seeing a painted page for what would eventually be Elektra Assassin by Bill Sienkiewicz. And I would say that was the first inkling of it, because that was the first time I saw this thing that I loved as a business. But I heard about Milestone in 1993 that I really thought about it as a career, and that was why I applied to be an intern there.
So what had you heard initially about Milestone, and what was it about it that intrigued you so much?
So with Milestone, they were doing a lot of interviews for their debut, and two of the interviews appeared in Previews magazine, which was the magazine by Diamond Comic Distributors, still being published to this day, and Advance Comics, which at the time was being published by Capital City Distributors, I believe they were called, and they've since gone out of business. And so I read both of those interviews, which were really extensive with the founders, and it showed these amazing illustrations by co-founder Dennis Cowan of the primary characters, Icon, Static, Hardware, the Blood Syndicate. And, you know, again, we're talking about the early 90s, and the superhero comic book landscape, for the most part, was quite ethnically homogenous. And so Milestone was something that was unprecedented, certainly in superhero comics. An entire universe of characters of color, of diverse backgrounds, diverse sexual lifestyles, from a publisher, a company that was founded and run by Black people. So the representation of that, I could not ignore that. I could not ignore that as a Black man in my early 20s who grew up as a child of the 70s and a teenager of the 80s, in which being a public comic book fan basically meant being a social pariah. So the existence of Milestone gave me an understanding that I had a place in the world. And so it was too magnetic to resist, and it was impossible to ignore.
I want to talk more about Milestone in a moment, but you just brought up a really excellent point. Is what was that like, that sort of isolation of being a comic fan, when saying something like that was a good way to get you, ridiculed by others? Because I mean, it's something I think a lot of fans have gone through.
Right. So, I live in Brooklyn, New York, where I was born and raised. And right now, I actually live about a 10-minute walk when I was in the second and third grade, and a 5-minute walk from the newsstand where my mom bought me comic books every week. So I'm a Black kid in Brooklyn in the 70s in Flatbush, and it was certainly not cool to be a comic book fan. Now, one of the things that I didn't understand is there were a lot of people that I knew that read comics, but it was their secret identity. It was not something that was part of their public persona, but it was something that they did when they went home. Whereas with me, I wore it on my skin. And so, I was not a jock by any stretch of the imagination. I was a bookworm, which was the term of the time, which would eventually be nerd. And so I did always feel like an outsider. I wasn't the person who was part of the social elite in any school that I was a part of. I might have been part of what we'll call an intellectual elite, because I was getting really stellar grades, but not part of a social elite, right? And so, I was a bit of an outcast. And as I got a little older and got into high school, I went to the High School of Art and Design. That's when I found more comic book fans, right? And then we kind of created a clique within art and design, which we affectionately call A&D, right? And so you had the comic book fans, and you had the artists, the top level artists in the school. You had people who were fans of the books that they were. So all of us were fans of art. So early on in my life, I believed, or I aspired to be a comic book artist. That did not turn out to be my path, but being an aspiring comic book artist, I knew who the artists of the time were. So I grew up on a really heavy diet of John Byrne and George Perez. Then, as I was heading into high school, comics were changing. Bill Sienkiewicz and Doug Moench were doing Moon Knight. You had Frank Miller and Klaus Janson's Daredevil, which, as we know, just changed superhero comics as we know it. You had, I think we were starting to get the first of the first comics. So then you had these really unusual comics. You had Mike Grell on John Sable Freelance. You had Howard Chaykin on American Flag. And I remember this strange, bizarre comic that came out from Frank Miller. I bought the first issue. I never read another issue, and I wouldn't re-engage it until college. And it was called Ronin. and Ronin was beyond me at the time. And so that's what happened in the 80s. I found more of what I would call my ilk, my people, right? And then we really engaged comic book artists and writers that we loved. And while I was in high school, you had a few artists come out that really changed the game. I still remember what it was like, not so much when his first miniseries came out, but when New Mutant Special Edition came out and everyone saw Art Adams, we were all going bonkers. And that was a book that you had to buy it fast or it was going to run out, because Marvel didn't even have any idea what they were doing with that book. The art was just amazing, and Art had worked on Longshot, but New Mutant Special Edition just took things to a whole new level. And if I remember correctly, I believe it was the first part of a two-part crossover with, I think, X-Men Annual 9, in which Storm got to wield Mjolnir, Thor's hammer, right? And so that was something major in terms of art that happened while I was in high school. Another thing that happened was Crisis on Infinite Earths, which, you know, talking about Crisis on Infinite Earths would be an interview in and of itself. But for a number of us, that was when DC became cool, because a bunch of us grew up. I was a second and third grade, and at that time, people said DC stands for dumb comics. And I think it was in the fourth grade or in between third and fourth grade, I went to Nassau, Bahamas for the summer because I have family there, and my mom would send me there every summer for 2 weeks. And one of my aunts bought me 6 comic books, and my mom used to buy me a maximum of 3 comic books every week. So when my aunt brought me 6, it was like it was my birthday. And one of them was Uncanny X-Men 112. On the cover, it said Magneto triumphant, and Magneto was fighting Storm, Colossus, and Wolverine. And it was by Chris Claremont, John Byrne, Terry Austin, and I think at the time, Glynis Oliver. And I would imagine the lettering Tom Orzechowski, I would imagine. But X-Men blew my mind, because the DC superheroes all basically had these great lives, whereas Marvel heroes, their lives were complicated and their powers made their lives more complicated. And X-Men was an analogy for prejudice. And I didn't even understand that deeply at the time, but something about the X-Men connected with me. And that's when I made the shift. And when I was in the 5th grade, there was a guy I knew named John, and he decided he was going to be an Avengers fan. And in 1 month, he bought 20 Avengers comics. And so I felt competitive, and I said, well, I'm going to collect X-Men comics. And then I just dove into X-Men. And at that time, the issue on the newsstands was X-Men 129, which was the introduction of Kitty Pryde. And it had Storm, Colossus, and I think Wolverine on the cover fighting these armored Hellfire Knights. And I think the cover text said, "Save me from the Knights of Hellfire." And then I was in. And then that took me into Dazzler, the Hellfire Club, the death of Phoenix, the funeral of Jean Grey, Cyclops leaving, Days of Future Past, the return of Dave Cockrum. But I was a Marvel head from that point on, and I was certainly an X-Men head from that point on.
So you, a young man, and you get this internship at Milestone. First impressions of it and first impressions of being in the business.
The first impressions of Milestone was that it was really the culmination of everything that I was and would be, right? Because it was it was comic books as a business. The creative architects were Dwayne McDuffie, whose work I had read. I was familiar with Deathlock, Dennis Cowan. I knew his work going back to Power Man and Iron Fist. Certainly Deathlock, of course, that he and Dwayne did together. I also knew his work from the Blind Justice story arc in Detective Comics that he did with Sam Hamm, the main screenwriter of Tim Burton's first Batman film. And so it was that. It was a concentration point for my emerging understanding of my Blackness, because that was something that I didn't really engage until I was in college and I read the autobiography of Malcolm X as told by Alex Haley. And then I started diving deep into the music of Public Enemy and really just expanding my understanding and coming to terms with my Blackness, which is something that I was really a person that concentrated on my geekness, but not my Blackness. And that started to hit home for me politically, sociologically in college when I was in the School of Visual Arts. And there was a clique of students there who were artists and activists and militants. And that's when I first started really getting confronted with my lack of understanding of being Black. And then Milestone, again, gave that a focus, along with the focus of comics and then business, because I had just finished working at an art supply store, and I was let go, and I was let go 2 days after a customer had called me a black bastard and 3 days before Christmas. And so Milestone was the first Black owned company that I worked at in my upper teens and adult years. And it was someplace that was a safe haven. And so my first impressions were nothing short of extraordinary. And not only did I get to see comic books being made, but I got to understand the business of it, how a company is run, how it works, how do finances work, how does the creation of comics connect to the economics. Milestone had a business partnership with DC Comics where Milestone owned and created the content. DC Comics was the publisher and handled the distribution through their relationship with Diamond. So I had insights into that relationship as well, that business partnership, and what that entails, a partnership, negotiations, and, you know, different people getting along with people not only from different ethnic cultures, but from different business cultures. Milestone DC Comics of the early 90s had a business culture, and I ended up learning that there were Black employees at DC Comics, and they were kind of a clique. So it was a very interesting time. So that was my first impression. And the 3 months that I was an intern were amazingly educational, and I did whatever they wanted me to do. And sometimes they wanted me to do things that were fun, and sometimes they wanted me to do things that were boring. But I treated everything with the same level of seriousness. And if I was given a task, I completed that task, right? And so what happened was, at the end of my internship, they offered me a part-time position as the assistant to the president, Derek T. Dingle. And that was the beginning of working for Milestone. And that was the beginning of working in comics.
One name that you mentioned is a name that it's one of those names that I think a lot more comic fans should know, and that's Dwayne McDuffie. We've spoken to a number of folks who worked with Milestone, and the stories you hear about him, he just seems like an incredible guy. What were your impressions of him, and do you have any cool stories you could tell about him?
So any comic book creator that doesn't know who Dwayne McDuffie is, they should educate themselves really quickly, because Dwayne McDuffie was a major force in comics and people are benefiting from his contributions. And I could talk for half a day with all the stories that I have about Dwayne. If I think about one that I haven't told that much, but it's an anecdote that speaks again to Blackness and his interest and who he was. So one of the CDs, the albums that I had on replay a lot in the early 90s was Ice Cube's Death Certificate. It was his second album and the one I consider the best, better than America's Most Wanted. And so Dwayne usually had his office door open. If he had it closed, he was in a meeting or he was writing, but usually the door was open. And I heard this music coming out of it and I recognized it from the album. So I walked in there and I said, "Oh, you like Ice Cube?" And he said, "This isn't Ice Cube, man. This is Parliament." And so Parliament, of course, is the industry and culture changing band that Ice Cube and a number of other hip hop artists sampled. And so that right there opened my eyes to, okay, I don't know what the source material is. He does know what the source material is, right? And that was just one of those funny interactions that we could have. But if you go through the work he did, especially Icon, a lot of references to bands like Parliament in the Icon comic books, right? In the subtitles of the comic books, in titles of stories. He really injected a lot of culture into the work he did on Icon and the work he did on Hardware. And so that would be a quick Dwayne McDuffie anecdote that I think, really speaks to the man.
What did you learn on the business aspect? Because you brought up the business aspects of Milestone as well. What's the thing that you took away most from seeing the business interactions that were going on?
That one of the highest responsibilities of any organization is to take care of its people, right? So it's your responsibility to make sure that your people get their paychecks. Even if for a week or two, you don't get a paycheck. Your job is to take care of your people. And so I saw how the business made sure that the employees were taken care of. And I would say that is the most important lesson that I learned in terms of business from Milestone.
Do you have a favorite book that you worked on?
Wow, that I worked on at Milestone. That's interesting. In terms of deeply editing, I think it would be maybe the 50th issue of Hardware, which was the last published issue of the first volume, the version of Milestone, because it was the culmination of this big storyline, and in a way it closed the loop on Hardware. You could take Hardware 50, and if you chose, you could go back to Hardware number 1 and start the whole journey again. And it was the last book I edited for the company. When the company was in its last legs, they were out of money. They were really low on money, and they could not afford to pay some of us. So, of course, in a situation like that, you have the option to leave. They were very transparent with us about that. And because of all they had given me and because of my work ethic, I didn't believe on leaving with a mission that was incomplete. So I stayed 2 extra weeks and I wrapped up Hardware 50. I wrapped it up, I put it to bed, I handed it in, and then I left. So that book, not only as a comic book, but as the end of my time with that iteration of Milestone, I would say would make it my favorite comic, and in a number of ways my career.
Now, how did you move from this formative experience at Milestone and this, creative juggernaut to DC proper and ultimately, editing Batman or the Batman titles?
So what happened was, DC and Milestone had a partnership. And because of that, the DC employees and the Milestone employees knew one another. That relationship had become enhanced during the crossover event Worlds Collide, in which the Superman books tied into the Milestone books. And I think it was because of that that we had this get together at the Milestone offices, which at that time were 3 lofts that made up one Uber office, and had a number of the DC employees over just so people could meet each other and break bread and have fun with one another. So that was, I would say, my first real experience with DC employees. After Milestone, I did a brief editorial stint on a passion project that a friend referred me to. And then, so after that quick freelance gig, I ended up working in Simon & Schuster's Star Trek department for 7 weeks because a friend of mine told me about the job, said they needed an editorial assistant. And so at that time, Simon & Schuster basically regarded Star Trek as their most prized possession because it was the highest profit sector, even though most of the company treated the Star Trek group as the redheaded stepchild. They had to accept it because it helped keep the lights on, right? And so I worked there. So I worked as the editorial assistant to Margaret Clark, who ran the coffee table books and the nonfiction Star Trek books, and she herself was an alumni of DC editorial, and John Ordover, who ran the fiction books. And he was the one who introduced the concept of the multi-title crossover to Star Trek novels. He took that from his fanhood of comic books and he brought that to Star Trek. So I was working there. And what happened was, before I worked there, I temped DC Comics for 3 months. And I was working on Green Lantern and Chase and the Second Tangent event and different things. But I was working through a temp agency, so I'm an assistant editor in any of the books I did. And so after DC, I went to Simon & Schuster. Then what happened was, during my time at Simon & Schuster, Scott Peterson, who was the number 2 person in the Batman editorial department, announced that he was leaving. And I went to the offices on a Friday to pitch a short story to Jordan Gorfinkel for Batman Chronicles, because I was a big fan of Oracle. I'm still a big fan of Oracle to this day for a number of reasons, if you know my career. And so I said, hey, Gorf, I'd like to pitch an Oracle story for Batman Chronicles. And he said, hey, that's great, but I've got something else I want to talk to you about. We need an associate editor in the Batman department, and we'd like to offer you the job. So that blew me away, of course. Right? And that Monday, I go to Simon & Schuster and I talk to Margaret, and I say to her, and I say this to her, so I'm in my mid to upper 20s. I don't really have any business savvy, and internal conflict is a much greater thing, right? And so I say to her, hey, Margaret, I talked to you about something. I said, listen, I really appreciate all that y'all have done for me. You gave me a job when I needed it, but Denny O'Neil in the Batman group offered me a job, and I don't know what to do. And she said, are you kidding? You should run over there and take the job. And I said, okay. So I did. And that was how I got to DC Comics. And from what I was told, part of it was that when I temped there, I displayed organizational skills. And they felt like that was an essential ingredient that the Batman editorial group needed. And I didn't fully understand why until I got there, because when I got there, they were at the beginning of a 1-year weekly event called Batman No Man's Land. And the amount of coordination that was required for that was intense, because it was a weekly event, 52 books. That doesn't count one-offs. That doesn't count any crossovers with other DC books. If one of those books was late, the whole house of cards comes down. So that was not an option. And different creative teams were doing different storylines. So it wasn't one consistent team on Detective Comics, one consistent team on Shadow of the Bat, right? It was basically each month had its own creative team, because the storylines were vertical and not horizontal, right? So when I got there, one of the first things I did was I went to the office supplies catalog and I ordered the biggest whiteboard that they had in it, because we're talking the late 90s. I don't know if Excel was around, but we were still mostly using tangible assets for tracking, right? We were using photocopied sheets punched with 3 holes in big school binders, and we were using big erasable marker boards. And so in my office, I had the big chart, which represented 3 to 4 months of books in No Man's, markers with different color codes, right? So black was the basic structure of reality. Blue was things in progress and doing well. Red was things in serious danger. And green was completed, all good.
No, go ahead. I was just going to ask, you're explaining all this, and I'm saying to myself, if I was a young person and I was given this kind of responsibility, my head would explode. How were you handling the pressures that was coming with all this?
So I handled it for a number of reasons. Number one, because I had my training in Milestone, right? So in Milestone, I started in business, but I transitioned over to editorial. So my first experience as a member of an editorial department were at Milestone under the tutelage of Dwayne McDuffie, who history cannot deny is one of the greatest editors that the North American comic book industry ever employed. That's just a fact. That's not an opinion. Dwayne McDuffie is up there with Karen Berger, Archie Goodwin, Louise Simonson. You know, you have a Mount Rushmore, you have an upper pantheon. And so he is up there. And so I got trained in one of the best schools in comics, which was Milestone. And then additionally, it was just a work ethic. It's, well, I didn't come here to fail, right? I came here to succeed. And I felt like I had something to prove, because I was the first editor of color on Batman in the entire history of Batman comics. And so there was a particular responsibility of self to represent through performance, right? So that was one aspect of it.
What were you looking for to make a good Batman story?
So there was a Batman Bible, right? And side note, in terms of the guest appearances, you're now hearing the guest appearance of the Mr. Softy ice cream truck that goes around in my neighborhood, pass by my house during interviews. So we must have some kind of contract that I have totally forgotten about.
Yeah.
But I have to say, I want my cut.
Yeah, it's about
Like,
time.
what percentage of his profits am I going to make since we have this understanding? So anyway, so you had the Batman Bible, and the Batman Bible told you about Batman and the world of Gotham, supporting characters. And I grew up reading a lot of Batman comics. So there was an understanding that Batman as a character had rules. And the thing about No Man's Land is No Man's Land was more of a real world story. It dealt with real world issues. And so, you know, for me, it was about writers, it was about creators who could bring that to the comics. So one of the people I brought on was a novelist named Stephen Barnes, who has been a novelist, television writer now for, I believe, 35 years. He started as a protege, I believe, of Larry Niven, one of the most important science fiction writers of the 20th century. And he had written a trilogy of books, science fiction books that I really loved. And he also wrote the novelization of a popular Star Trek Deep Space Nine episode that I think was called Beyond the Stars, which involved Captain Sisko under a spell from the prophets of Bajor, and he goes back in the past, and he's, I believe, is an artist during the time of the World's Fair, and he's confronting institutional racism and prejudice. And so Stephen wrote the novelization of that. So I knew that he could really tap into character in amazing ways. So I brought him on to write a 2-part story within the No Man's Land year, and really got to work with great writers who ended up becoming friends: Greg Rucka, Devin Grayson, other writers that had never really worked on Batman stories before, but were invited to the scene. So Elisa Whitney, who was a early Vertigo editor, did a story, I believe it was in Batman Secret Files. It was illustrated by Michael Zulli. John Ostrander, who, of course, the seminal John Ostrander from his work on Suicide Squad, at his work at First Comics. I'm not remembering the name of the comic book.
Grimjack.
Grimjack, yes, Grimjack, which I believe, didn't Timothy Truman illustrate that?
I believe so, yeah.
I think so, right? So he ended up John Ostrander ended up writing a 6-part Catwoman story for us. I think he had written Batman before, but not in such a long-term stint. I believe he was the writer of the seminal comic book Batman's Seduction of the Gun, which was supposed to be a story about how the proliferation of guns hurts communities and especially endangers young people. I think John wrote that. So, you know, in terms of looking at writers, it was about character, and it was about what the real world underpinnings are under the superheroic fanfare and exaggeration of reality. What are the motivations under that govern that, right? So those were the things.
So I wanted to hop around your resume a little bit and ask you about Lion Forge. how you got involved with them, and what it was like establishing a graphic novel brand or even a superhero universe for Prime.
Okay, so I'm going to say one more thing about Batman because it's going to dovetail and transition to Lion Forge. So
Perfect.
when I was in the Batman office, so one of the things that happens that you don't really hear about is when there are big events make previous elements of continuity obsolete. And one thing about the Batman department is they had a lot of books done in advance. I think it was a model that was reputed to come from Virginia Romita, so that if any comic book in any series is running late, Virginia Romita believed in the inventory issue, and it was already done, and you would pull it out of the flat file and you would say, this is going to be the issue of Spider-Man that's going to come out next, right? Or the Hulk or the Avengers and so on and so forth. So the Batman department had a number of books that were done in advance, and No Man's Land rendered a lot of them obsolete, and it wiped them off the publication schedule, and they were never going to come out because No Man's Land totally changed the status quo of Gotham City. So anything that reflected a pre-NML Gotham City didn't make sense anymore, right? One of those books was a book called Batman the Hill. Batman the Hill was written by Christopher Priest and illustrated by Sean Martinborough and John Lowe, and I believe it was colored by Matt Hollingsworth, and I believe it was lettered by Todd Klein or Clem Robbins, one of them. And what this one shot was about, it was about a crime occurred in a part of Gotham called the Hill that Batman never went to. And so when he went there, that's where most of the Black citizens of Gotham lived. And so when he went there, he was impotent. They never saw him. So the legend of the Batman did not represent fear. It did not represent anything. He was silly. He was incongruous to that environment. So Batman had to learn to change his rules to understand the Hill so that he could operate in it to solve this crime. And so this was a story that was a real world story about Batman having to confront his own internal prejudices regarding his city, because there should never be a corner of Gotham that he doesn't know about, right? And so this book was all done in black and white. All the pages were done. I don't think they were lettered, but they were done. And this book was not going to come out. It was going to get wiped off the slate. And I knew this book had to come out, that it was an important Batman story, and it was an important thing for DC Comics to do, right? And so I pulled it out of the flat file. I got that book lettered. I got the inks touched up. I got that book colored, the cover colored. The #2 art director at the time, Curtis King, he and I worked on it. He put a logo on it, and that book came out, right? So Batman the Hill came out, and to this day, the Hill is part of the Batman publishing plan. The Hill was shown recently in an issue of Batman Black and White, in a story that was written by Brandon Thomas and illustrated by Kari Randolph. Sean Martinborough wrote a 2-part story in, I think, Red Hood and the Outlaws, where Red Hood goes back to the Hill and you revisit descendants of the characters of the Hill. And so that book became part of the Gotham architecture. Now, so fast forward 17 years into the future, and David Stewart II, who founded Lion Forge, and his partner, Carl Reed, they approached me to basically spearhead a superhero universe for them. David was highly influenced and inspired by the Milestone books of the 90s, and especially the character Static, who had gone on to be in his own cartoon, Static Shock, which would have a major impact on one or two generations of people. To see a young Black male teenage superpowered hero in animation as the titular star for the first time, right? Their own milestone. And so, of course, I was going to take that on, because coming from Milestone from the 20th century and doing this in the 21st century, when there was no Milestone at the time, the new iteration of Milestone did not come back in force until 2021, right? So there wasn't anything like it in comics after Milestone stopped publishing in 1997, even though it would come back in these crossover events with DC Comics. And so when they brought me on board to do that, I knew that the first thing that had to be done was to assemble the writers, because it all starts with the writing. The writing is the floor upon which you start building the fiction, right? You get your writers, you get your artists, colorists and letterers, you get your designers, but you have to start with the writers. And so I took a model from television and I created the Catalyst Prime Writers Room. And there were 7 writers. And one of them, who turned out to be the linchpin in a sense, was Christopher Priest from Batman the Hill, right? And whose work I really admired in a series that came out from DC in 1997 called Zero. And Christopher Priest was actually one of the founders of Milestone. Now, he separated from Milestone before Milestone books started coming out in February of 1993, but he was one of the founders. He wrote the first version of the Milestone Bible that Dwayne McDuffie and others would then build upon. He was the editor of the Impact line at DC Comics, so he would work at DC by day, and at night he would be in the DC offices working on the Milestone Bible, right? So I felt like there was something perfect about Christopher coming on board to be part of the writer's room for what basically was going to be the 21st century Milestone. So I remember I was at San Diego Comic-Con, and I think it was 2016, and he was on a panel talking about Deathstroke. And somehow I heard this, and I said, okay, I have to go to that panel. I went to that panel, and before he could get out of the room, I approached him at like 100 miles per hour and said, hey, nice to meet you. My name is Joseph Illidge. I'm a big admirer of your work. If you have time for coffee or lunch, I'd really like to talk to you about an interesting project. And I did, and he said yes. And then I assembled the other writers, really an amazing team. Brandon Thomas, David F. Walker, Sheena Sixta Campi, Amy Chu, Joe Casey, Ramon Govea. Like, it was basically the Avengers, right? And so we had a 2-day conference in LA. I think it was that August. And what came out of that was the first iteration of the Catalyst Prime Bible, which basically took what I learned from Milestone, because Milestone was the first company I worked at where I saw a Bible. The Milestone Bible, I think, was 120 pages. I actually have a copy of it. And that was the first time I saw a comprehensive superhero universe Bible. The Batman Bible was the second one that I saw. The Milestone was the first. So we created the Bible. Then I started assembling the artists, then the colorists, then the letterers, because every aspect of the process is an art form. So I chose the letterers and matched them up to the books with very specific intent of matching styles and aesthetics. One of the letterers that we were blessed to get on board, I'm so glad he said yes, was Todd Klein, who is basically on the Mount Rushmore of letterers in comics, right? And so he was great because he had to do this series that jumped back and forth between the modern day and a digital simulation of comics from the 50s and the 60s. So he had to emulate styles, 2 or 3 different styles. And so put the team together, got the approved budgets, and it was a situation where Lion Forge was a company that had a certain budget scale because they were all licensed comics. But when it came to creating your own superhero universe, now, of course, that's considered suicidal, right? Because as a culture, as a planetary global culture, and especially now in the multimedia world that we live in, where everyone knows the name Thanos, Marvel and DC are superheroes. And everybody else is riding on the coattails of Marvel and DC, right? So to put forth a superhero universe was a courageous move. So what I said to them is, okay, the quality level has to be at the top, right? Because the fans need to see that, the retailers need to see that, which means that your budgets need to match that, which means I need to be able to pay Christopher Priest what he gets at DC Comics. I need to be able to pay Amy Chu what she gets at DC Comics. I need to be able to pay Ken Lashley what he asked for. He was originally going to be one of the artists that didn't work out, but that's what happens. But still, we had to have competitive rates. And so that was something I advocated for. They approved it. So we had competitive rates. And then it took about, I'd say, 10 months to put the first wave of books together, like the first few issues of the first titles, because we launched in May of 2017, and we were one of, Lion Forge was the big story of New York Comic Con 2016, like bigger than Marvel. It was the big story, and the company had introduced 3 different departments. One was the acquisition of Magnetic Press. The other one was the creation of a middle grade and kids line called Roar. And then the third one was Catalyst Prime. And so the announcement was huge, and we had to live up to that. And so the first comic book we decided would be a free comic book for Free Comic Book Day. And usually, Free Comic Book Day books are mostly, if not entirely, reprints. So we figured, well, let's do a fully original comic book by top talent and make that free as your entryway into this new universe. And that's what we did. So Catalyst Prime, the event, was the origin of this world of fantastic people. And that week, issue 1 of the first title of the 7 titles of the series, Noble Number 1, also came out. So that way, if you walk into the store that Saturday, Free Comic Book Day, you get Catalyst Prime, the event, then the retailer could direct you to Noble Number 1, And you as a reader, you could read Catalyst Prime, the event, for which the last 3 pages had a major shock ending. A shock ending that a retailer compared to Watchmen. And that would lead you right into Noble #1, and we hit the ground running. Noble #1 was, someone called it, like, one of our staffers said it was like the cold open of a James Bond film. It was not verbose. It was not talky. It was not a lot of talking heads. It was, there's a helmeted man on the run, and he's being chased, and you don't know why, and he has telekinetic powers. And that's how we did it. That's how we launched. We launched with a bang, literally and figuratively.
That's an amazing origin story for an entire, line of comics and superhero universe. It strikes me in your telling and in your answers to a lot of the other questions, how passionate the role you play as an editor and organizer of these things. I find that a lot of editors sometimes use it as almost a backdoor to becoming a writer, which is fine. But you seem to really enjoy bringing the right people on board, organizing the experience so that everybody is well valued and compensated, and putting out then a product that has been architected in such a way that it's really of great quality and value to the consumer. Is that I mean, have you hit on that early in your career, that you were just like, I like this, I don't necessarily need to go and be the writer, I like to be sort of the quarterback of the entire operation?
So it's interesting, and thank you for your kind words. And so when I started at Milestone, I did want to be a writer. And remember, I started in business.
Mm-hmm.
But before I worked in editorial, I observed Dwayne. I interacted with him, and he would spit out these pearls of wisdom. And as a comic book kid and teenager, the editorial credit meant nothing to me. I was all about, who is the writer, who is the penciler, who is the inker. I may get a sense of the colorist, who's the cover artist. Is this book, does this issue of Power Man and Iron Fist have a special cover by Frank Miller? Right? Something like that. Or did Barry Windsor Smith do a special cover? Right? But I ignored the credit of editor entirely. But experiencing Dwayne McDuffie really made me understand that it was a position of purpose. And I wanted that. I admired bringing people together, making amazing stories, and interacting with people. I admired it greatly, and I decided that I wanted that. And so I transitioned over from business to editorial, and Dwayne took me under his wing. He was the first person that showed me what being an editor was. The second person that would show me that would be Denny O'Neil, right? Arguably, again, one of the legendary editors of comics, one of the legendary writers of comics, and one of history's greatest author architects of Batman and Green Arrow, right? And by extension, I learned a number of things about being an editor from the Batman editorial team. Jordan Gorfinkel, Darren Vincenzo. When I was at Milestone, in addition to Dwayne McDuffie, I learned a lot from Matt Wayne, who was a #2 in the editorial department, and from Jacqueline Ching, who was an editor as well. So I really learned from the people who were doing it longer than me. And the purpose of it, right, is a good purpose. That's how you got the amazing stories in comics. And if you look at the time when I was entering comics, and you think about, well, what was an editorial masterpiece? In addition to the Milestone universe, quite frankly, we'd have to fairly say that the death of Superman, reign of the Superman, and the return of Superman on the part of Mike Carlin is an editorial masterpiece. Before I came on board, you'd have to say that the whole arc of Batman, so Batman getting his back broken by Bane, Azrael becoming Batman, Batman going on a quest to regain his abilities, and Batman regaining the identity of Batman, Bruce Wayne, more accurately, regaining that. That's an editorial masterpiece. And so I realized that that was what I wanted to do, even more than writing. I had the writing bug from college, but editing is the purpose that I would serve. And I still love it to this day. Now, this year is my 30th anniversary of starting in comics and, in publishing in general. And it's still very exciting. It's exciting to bring people together. It's exciting to see these new things pop up in your inbox, for things to surprise you, for things to come out exactly the way you envisioned, to meet your vision. And, to be quite candid, listen, I have been a taskmaster. So there are some people who have like perfect editorial record. That is Archie Goodwin, God rest his soul. Right? That is probably Karen Berger, God rest her. I mean, and Karen is still with us, of course. I consider Karen Berger editor in North American comics. And so for me, it's always about quality, and then, embracing the role more. It's about the people, right? It's about the creators, because so up until COVID-19, most people did not understand what a solitary lifestyle working from your home was. But this is something that comic book creators have been living with since the beginning of the comic book industry as we know it, going back to the 30s, and people like, Jack Kirby and, Wally Wood and like the legends and the greats, right? Obviously Siegel and Schuster. And so Bill Finger, all these people. So, people who are spending most time by themselves, they need human interaction. Sometimes they need guidance. Sometimes they need an ally to advocate for them. Sometimes they just need a friend for 5 minutes or just someone to talk to. So I realized that it's not only the books, but it's the people making the books, right? And so that's exciting. It's exciting to craft these worlds, these stories. And if you're fortunate, you will have a hand in making something that will stand the test of time and still have impact a generation later. So my heart is still always warmed when someone tells me that Cassandra Cain as Batgirl was the first time they saw themselves represented as a character, is their favorite character in comics. The run I did on Birds of Prey, which will always be one of the editorial joys of my career in life, getting to work with Butch Geis and Gloria Vasquez. And at that time, the number one writer, Chuck Dixon, was doing the best scripts. Birds of Prey was really like this great comic. And the first issue that we did after No Man's Land did not involve superheroics. Dinah Lance had a next door neighbor who was an abused mob wife. And Barbara Gordon was meeting Ted Cord, the now deceased second Blue Beetle, on like a blind date. Right? So it was this very human story, which then kicked off some big stories. But in our run, Barbara got to confront the Joker in an issue that was very Silence of the Lambs-ish, Birds of Prey 16. Barbara and Dinah met in Birds of Prey 21 because for the first few years of their relationship, they never met. So Dinah was operating from a voice of someone whose name she didn't know, and they developed this long distance friendship, these two women. And when they saw each other, they hugged and they cried, but they only had a minute. But that is such a pivotal moment in those characters, and I love both of those characters. They're still two of my favorites to the day. So yeah, I do feel passionately about being an editor or editorial director, the role of the editor in read comics. I feel like I can intuit editorial identity, right? I feel like I can look at a book at a company and say, this person, either this person or this person edited this book, right? And that's something, because editors are basically supposed to be invisible. The creators go in the front, the editor operates in the shadows, but editorial identity is real. And so that's something that when I look throughout my career thus far, I feel like there is a consistency of themes. There's a consistency of characters. There's a consistency of representation. There's a consistency of, no matter how fantastic the framework and trappings of the story, there's a clear human underpinning and you see it, right? So whether that's Batman, Birds of Prey, whether that's Tarna from Heavy Metal, whether that's Livewire from Valiant, whether that's the entire Catalyst Prime universe, which really had more of a real world aspect to it, that is something that I feel like is thematic.
I want to be mindful of your time, but I just want to touch on for a moment Judge Kim and putting a book out for children. How important was it for you to get that out there and to reach a younger audience and get them into reading?
You know, it was really important. So Judge Kim, the writers are Milo Stone, Sean Martin Bro, and myself. The artist is Christopher Jordan. All of us are alumni of the School of Visual Arts. So it was really kind of like this SVA alumni team effort. And, you know, Judge Kim and the Kids Court, you know, there's 2 books in the series. Simon & Schuster is a publisher, and it's part of their program called Ready to Read Graphics. So it's first stage graphic novels for kids 4 to 8, right? And Judge Kim is the kind of book that I wish was out when I was a kid, right? Because again, I was a kid in the 70s, and in terms of like lead characters in kids' books, I think that were Black, I think you had Encyclopedia Brown, basically. And that was probably it, right? In terms of like a lead character. And so Judge Kim as this young Black girl who goes to her mom's job one day. Her mom is a judge, and she sees that. And so she becomes inspired to be a judge for kids in her neighborhood. And her dad builds her this treehouse. She turns it into a court. And when there are conflicts between the kids in the neighborhood, no one's hitting each other, right? No one is canceling one another. Kim is like, let's take it to court, right? And what you have is you have peaceful conflict resolution and you have empathy. which are two things our society could use a bit more of. And you have the law, right? And not the law in the sense that you can pass the bar exam after reading the Judge Kim books, but the law in the sense that you have kids thinking about that at an early age, at a time when we don't have enough civic education in schools for kids. Kids are not being educated to have any understanding, basic to evolving, of how their government works or how law works, right? And so by doing these children's books, in addition to telling this fun story about this young girl who has to go on her own personal journey to become Judge Kim, it's basically like Judge Kim Begins, like Batman Begins, and Daniel Craig's Casino Royale, which I call James Bond Begins. It's basically Judge Kim Begins, right? And so to have this Black girl go on a journey and become this person that represents ethics and law and empathy in her neighborhood is something that other Black girls can see and other kids can see and say, hey, my community could be like this. I could be like this. And that sets you on the road to being a better citizen and being a better human being, right? So funny enough, it's like taking all of my experiences as an editor and as an author and bringing them to children's books and also providing an example. So the same way how Milestone Static, when that comic book came out in 1993, I wish there was a Static when I was a kid, because I wish I could have seen a Black kid who was considered but was really a cool, amazing kid. I wish I'd had that. I didn't have that, right? So Judge Kim, those books represent the kind of books that I would like to have had when I was a kid, and so kids can have that. And so it's the paying forward, right? It's the proliferation of story, and story and narratives are at the fulcrum of our entire existence.
Makes a lot of sense. Joseph, I think we could go on forever. I mean, your career has gone to so many different places, and I hope you'll consider coming on again so we can get to those places. But as we wrap up, I'd love to know what your current projects are, or anything we can look forward to.
Sure. So number one, thank you again for having me. I'd love to come back, talk with you guys some more. So we'll definitely have to do a sequel.
Awesome.
Present project. So right now I'm the writer of a monthly column at thepopverse.com called Adventures in the Champagne Room, in which I'm basically talking about the behind the scenes dynamics and the business of comics, and an honest look at the problems of comics and a conversation about some of the solutions, right? Because the North American comic book industry has basically been around for almost 100 years. And we are still dealing with wage issues. We are still dealing with people retiring, and they don't have the financial resources to take care of their medical needs. So you have William Messner Loebs and Peter David and Len Kaminsky, and you have to have these GoFundMe campaigns, and there's an organization, the Hero Initiative. The Hero Initiative has to be an organization that saves creators, right? So almost 100 years, and this industry somehow is still leading to bad endings and is still leading to people who live marginally or decently or well, but high stress. And so, it's going to be a conversation about the reality of this industry and how we can escape these traps, right? So that's one of the things I'm working on. And I'm working on a number of writing projects, but I can't mention any of them now. Be able to talk about them all next year. One of them, though, is Ahoy Comics is doing this crazy anthology series called Project Cryptid about mythological monsters in our society. And I wrote a story that very much keys into being a Brooklyn born and raised person and also being of Jamaican heritage, because I'm Jamaican American. My mom was born in Jamaica. I was born here in Brooklyn. So it's a really crazy story. And so Project Cryptid is running from September of this year to February of next year. So my issue should be getting solicited soon, but in months to come, I'll be able to talk about the variety of different things I'm working on. And then I'm editing secret projects for private clients. And, I'm a consultant. So I really work with a lot of different writers and creators on turning their ideas into graphic novels and comic books of quality, right? It's always about start with the best book. The best book can take you to other places, but let's always start with the best stories, the best art, the best books. So suffice it to say, I'm staying busy and just making sure to, support the creators who are out there and continue to buy the stuff that's really good or is really exciting me. And as crazy as this industry is, this is an exciting time.
Oh, for sure. And that all sounds fascinating. And yeah, next time we'll have to get into the consultancy, because I find that really interesting to have, consultation services for comics, which
All right.
I think is probably very needed.
Oh, definitely. It's amazing all the clients I've had in the last few years and the people who really want this.
Yeah.
Right? They want it. They didn't realize that it was out there. And so connecting with those people and helping them shape their stories into a tangible, high quality reality, that's exciting to me. That's as exciting to me as working on Batman, right? It's like, It's a different set of conditions, but again, it's all in the helping people and elevating creators to realize their visions. So yeah, next time I come back, if you want, we can do a deep dive into that.
All right.
Please.
That sounds good. That'll be a deal.
And we are back. Yes, Joe Illidge is awesome on so many levels. He is definitely someone who's got to come back to the show because we can just talk to him about everything and anything. And I think that's wonderful. I loved his stories about the great writer Christopher Priest. What a talent he is. And the two of them work together on when they're talking about that Batman book, The Hill, which I highly recommend people to go in to check out. Wonderful writing, and Joe was a big part of that.
Yeah. He also talked a lot about Milestone and Milestone Media and the Milestone imprint, and what a revolutionary imprint that was, and continues to be. There's all kinds of other work that comes out of that. So and even doing some children's books as well. So really would love to have him back on, plumb more of the depths of his career. But for today, that'll do it. Please remember to rate, review, and subscribe. Thank you again for listening. Thank you for reviewing. Thank you for everything. You make the everything Dollar Bin Bandits go around. So thank you again, and we'll see you next time. Peace.